Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you are calling in or watching this from Europe or other parts of the world. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I am also the Interim Director of the Global Europe Program, while we look for somebody who's much better equipped than I am to do the job. It is my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to our event, Germany After COP26, Europe's driving force to get to net zero. At the Global Europe Program, one of our major aims is to make a significant contribution to transatlantic climate cooperation and to strengthen Washington's understanding of European, and in today's case, Germany's climate policies. We have the opportunity today to review the results of COP26 in Glasgow and discuss the road ahead, because let's face it, now comes the hard part. Up until this point, we've had very difficult negotiations, but now with the rubber meets the road and we really have to do some very difficult things in terms of policy. So what do the new pledges and commitments from Glasgow mean in practical terms? How is Germany going to manage the green transition? How can it be a leader within Europe and bring others along with it? Those are some of the questions that we want to dig into today. First of all, however, I would very much like to thank the German Embassy in the United States for partnering with the Wilson Center for this important conversation. Special thanks to Judith Newman, who has been indispensable for planning this event. One of our other partners today is the Transatlantic Climate Bridge, an initiative to promote and facilitate climate cooperation between the United States, Germany, and Canada. The Wilson Center is part of the consortium behind the bridge, which is sponsored by the German Ministry for the Environment and the German Federal Foreign Office. The bridge just launched its website last week, so please keep an eye out for more events and activities in the months to come. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Emily Haber. She has been Germany's ambassador to the United States since June of 2018. Prior to her transfer to Washington, D.C., she served in various leadership functions at the Foreign Office in Berlin. In 2009, she was appointed political director, and in 2011, state secretary, the first woman to hold either post. Thereafter, she was deployed to the Federal Ministry of the Interior, serving as state secretary in charge of Homeland Security and migration policy from 2014 until 2018. Ambassador Haber has many years of experience with Russia and the former Soviet Union. She held various posts at the German Embassy in Moscow, including head of the political department. At the Foreign Office in Berlin, she served as head of the OSCE division and as deputy director for the Western Balkans, among other positions. Ambassador Haber, welcome to the Wilson Center. I hope you consider this to be one of your think tank homes in Washington. We'd love to have you here in person as soon as it is feasible and safe to do so. But for now, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Duncan. And I promise I'm going to be at the Wilson Center as soon as that will be possible. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. If you're not in the United States and if you're in Europe, welcome to the event. I really think that today's topic is a very relevant one. As you mentioned just a few days ago, the climate conference in Glasgow has been brought to a close. Expectations were very high to deliver meaningful outcomes that would change the trajectory of a changing world. Sustainable decisions are desperately needed to speed up climate action and strengthen global solidarity. Now, the outcome has been lauded by some and has been criticized by others. It's true, I believe not everything we wanted has been achieved, but I do believe we have ample reason to be satisfied. For the first time in the history of the UN climate change conferences, the final declaration contains an agreement on accelerating the global energy transition away from coal. And linked to this is the elimination of subsidies for fossil fuels. I think that's a big win. It's a big win because it means that international climate policy has carved out a new economic model and that the energy transition is now unavoidable and on its way. We must also not forget that compared to 4 years ago, the US are back on track. They're pushing for ambitious climate measures. China and India have pledged climate neutrality until 2060 and 2070, respectively. Critics would probably still argue that pledges alone are not enough to bring us down to 1.5 Celsius, and that will not make a difference unless these promises are translated into action. Actually, I agree with that. However, past conferences have been focusing on setting targets. And now for the first time, this conference also addressed the issue how to achieve them. And that's worth noting. Therefore, this COP showed that the world is determined to pursue the common goal of a climate neutral economy, and that it is also determined to deliver on the commitments. Germany was among the frontrunners of the global agreement, both as a leading negotiator for the EU and as part of a new cooperation, which will support South Africa in its phase out of coal. Another key element of the final declaration is solidarity with countries that are already hit hard by climate change. Support for these countries in terms of adaptation is to be doubled by 2025. Germany currently provides 2 billion euros for adaptation finance, makes it one of the leading donors. Cooperation is the only way to achieve results on this issue. Global challenges can only be tackled globally, jointly by all relevant actors. That is why President Biden and Chancellor Merkel launched the US-Germany Climate and Energy Partnership in July as part of our joint effort to address the threat of climate change. Actually, the inaugural meeting took place just last Friday. I believe that this partnership is a good example for our improved transatlantic relationship. We've managed to put many controversial issues of the last 4 or 5 years behind us, and we're able once again to focus on what is strategically important for both of us. As the July statement lays out, we share the goals of leading the world to develop the innovative tools urgently needed to accelerate global climate action and to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in our economies by 2050 at the latest. The partnership also aims to raise climate ambition and to help and develop and deploy critical energy technologies, and also to accelerate sustainable energy deployment in emerging economies. 2 areas in particular are important to mention here. One is offshore wind, and the other is hydrogen. Green hydrogen generated by renewable power is a versatile, clean energy that has the potential to replace natural gas in many processes and can help to decarbonize sectors like the steel or the cement industry. Offshore wind can deliver large amounts of clean, renewable energy. Winds are less obstructed out in the sea, allowing wind farms to produce electricity very efficiently. Europe's been a leader in this technology. But we know that the United States is planning to catch up fast. President Biden has set a goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and that's enormous. Developing new technologies like hydrogen or reaching targets like those for offshore wind will require large amounts of investments. And these investments cannot only come from governments. Industry needs to be engaged and needs to deliver as well. The private sector will be central to making the energy transition a success. And as I said, cooperation is the only way to achieve results. We must work together and include all fields and all stakeholders, from federal and local governments to industry, academia with research and development, and society. It's crucial in order to make the change and to deliver on measures and actions that will be helping the planet breathe again. So let me close by wishing you and all of us inspiring discussions today. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much for speaking in such an eloquent and knowledgeable manner about this very important issue. And let me just say that you said something at the very beginning, which I think is important to underline, which is that, yes, I think many of us recognize that we still need to do more, but it is extraordinary when we think about how far we've come and how quickly we are catching up to where we should be. And I think it's cause for optimism, whilst at the same time never taking our eyes off the goal, which is that we constantly need to be thinking about ways in which we reduce not just our carbon footprint, but our environmental footprint in general. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Vera Rodenhoff, who is from with the German government, who has been able to join us today, and we're very, very grateful, Vera, for that. She will provide us with some insights about the German negotiations at COP26. A brief introduction, if I may. Ms. Rodenhoff is head of division in the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation Building, and Nuclear Safety. She leads a team responsible for international cooperation on environment, energy, and cities, as well as cooperation with non-European OECD countries and the OECD. Her previous positions in the ministry include Head of Cabinet to the Federal Ministry of the Environment, Head of Division of International Affairs and Protocol in the Minister's Staff, Personal Secretary to the Minister, as well as Policy Advisor on International Legal Affairs. Before entering the ministry in 2005, Vera worked inter alia as an associate for the think tank Ecologic Institute and as a lawyer advising the German government on European and international environmental law and policy issues. The floor is yours, Ms. Rodenhoff.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and hello everyone. I'm happy to be here and talk to you a little bit about COP26, and especially happy to have been in the United States last week to kick off with the steering committee on the climate and energy partnership between the US and Germany, also that our ambassador mentioned earlier. So looking at COP26 now, the ambassador already said, of course, it didn't achieve everything that is needed to keep the country below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And we always wish to achieve more at these COPs, but it was definitely a milestone and picking up on some of the momentum from the street. Now, if we look at the COP in terms of buckets, if you may, there's a bucket for ambition, one for action, and one for negotiation. And we think that the COP delivered to some extent on all three. Now, there were many pledges that were made at the COP, and the IEA has calculated that the commitments coming out of COP26, if implemented, would put the energy sector, which is one of the most crucial to achieve the needed transformation, for limiting global warming to 1.8 degrees Celsius. That is obviously not 1.5, but it is definitely something. But that is if all the commitments that were named there and the pledges would be implemented. So certainly now is the time for implementing these pledges. Which were these? We saw many commitments around NDC updates and 2030 targets. We saw net zero pledges, mostly to middle of the century, plus minus, on including from Thailand, Nepal, Nigeria, Vietnam, and India. We saw that there will be another NDC update foreseen next year for the update for 2030 targets and a process for that. On climate finance, while we did not achieve the 100 billion, the delivery plan that was worked on also by our State Secretary Flaspat together with the former Ministry of Environment from Canada, Wilson, helped avoid a deadlock and helped reach an agreement on the further process around reaching those 100 billion by 2023. So there is something there as well. And there was a further process around aligning climate finance also for adaptation. Of course, much more needs to be done here, it goes without saying. And what we have seen is that the Climate Tracker recently estimated that we look at these pledges, there is still a gap from the greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 to be around twice as high as they would need to be to get us on track for the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. But we saw much on the action track. So our ambassador mentioned the commitments around coal. There were commitments around ending public support for unabated coal. And there were commitments around ending fossil fuel subsidies. And there was something else that we saw here, which was new, and that was really even more streamlining of climate and energy. And the breakthrough agenda was about setting sectoral targets for some energy sectors, not only for clean power, but also vehicles, steel, and hydrogen. So these will be some things we're going to look out for and where we hope to see more momentum next. And there were also partnerships around just transition, one with South Africa, where we partnered with the United States, France, and the UK around achieving a just transition in the energy sector in South Africa. So many other new initiatives as well. We signed the Global Methane Pledge, gladly pledged from the United States and the EU. And there were commitments around forest pledges. And we also very much welcomed the US-China agreement. So overall, I think there is a positive thing we can see here moving forward, but of course, much more needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rodenhoff. That was a terrific introduction for us to what the German government saw at the negotiations. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Lauren Herzer-Risi, who is the Program Director of the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. We're delighted to partner with ECSP for this programming. Lauren works with policymakers, practitioners, donors, and researchers to generate innovative transdisciplinary solutions to development and security challenges related to environmental change and natural resource management. She's also the Managing Director of New Security Beat, an award-winning blog, co-producer of a series of podcasts, and most importantly, she's one of my favorite colleagues here at the Wilson Center and a delight to work with also. Lauren, thank you so much for partnering with us on this. I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Duncan, and it's mutual. I want to thank Duncan and Ambassador Haber and Ms. Rodenhoff for all those great opening remarks. You've laid the foundation for a great discussion today. We don't have nearly enough time to do the topic justice, so I'm going to quickly introduce our panel and dive right into it. Andreas Goltau is the Franz O'Neill Professor for Public Policy of the Willy Brandt School, University of Erfurt, and research group leader at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. Andreas is also a non-resident fellow with the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines, the Global Public Policy Institute, and the German Council on Foreign Relations, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. Gunnar Luder leads the Energy Systems Group at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's also the lead scientist for the development of the Integrated Energy Economy Climate Model, REMIND, and holds the chair for Global Energy Systems Analysis at Technical University Berlin. Maria Pastakova is the Senior Policy Advisor at E3G, an independent European climate change think tank with a global outlook. She leads E3G's work on energy diplomacy, international energy finance, and geopolitics of the energy systems transition. Her particular focus is the energy dimension of the EU Green Deal and its geopolitical and economic implications. It's a great panel and definitely experts on many of the aspects of the conversation that the ambassador and Ms. Rodenhoff sort of set the ground with. Gunnar, let's start with you. Can you help us understand what is at stake right now, the scale of the challenge? What's the state of play? And I know you have a couple of slides to help us visualize what we're up against. So you can go ahead and share your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and the chance to discuss implications of the transition to greenhouse gas neutrality for Germany. I did bring two figures to kind of illustrate that the opportunities and challenges related to that transition. First, let me start with the graph visualizing the greenhouse gas emissions in Germany since 1990. 1990 is important because this is a reference date for which our emission reduction pledges are formulated. We barely achieved the reduction target of 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 for 2020, but that was also helped in part by the COVID crisis, which resulted in a substantial reduction of emissions in Germany, just as in many other parts of the world. But what you also see from that graph is that to reach our future targets, minus 65% by 2030, and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045, we do need a rapid acceleration of the pace of decarbonization, roughly a 2.5-fold increase of the reduction rate relative to what we've seen over the last decade before COVID. If you break this down by different sectors of the economy, it gets very clear that much of these emission reductions that we saw in the past were from the energy supply sector, essentially electricity generation, where we had some success of replacing coal by renewable power. But then if you look at sectors where that create emissions from directly combusting fossil fuels on the demand side, such as industry processes, such as transportation, such as buildings, there was very limited progress in reducing emissions further. And clearly, as Duncan said, the hard part comes now, which is also taking care of these other sectors. Looking at this in energy terms, the scale gets further very clear if we break down final energy demand into these two baskets of electricity demand on the one hand side and non-electric energy demands for buildings, transport, industry here in the blue shades. And what we see is we made substantial progress in transforming our electricity supply towards renewables. So we have 40% renewable electricity by now in the German system. But since electricity only accounts for 20% of our energy and 80% are these mostly fossil energies on the demand side, there's still a very, very long road to be taken until we really reach overall renewables. So the challenge in essence is to get from 20% renewables as we have right now to 100% renewables in 25 years. And this basically can be requires three things. First is that we need to accelerate the transition to green electricity, and 2030 is really a key date there, where all of these scenario analysis that we see with different models and different institutes looking into that, they all very, very robustly say by 2030 we need to have 90% of our electricity transformed to green electricity. But then two other components, we need to broaden the scope of electricity in supplying final energy demand. And this is really what mostly happens after 2030. For example, by electrifying road transportation, by using heat pumps for heating our homes, which will drastically reduce the blue part, which is much harder to transition to renewables. But there will be some remaining non-electric energy demands, for example, for industrial processes, for steel baking, for the chemical industries. And for those, we need new renewable solutions that we so far don't even have markets for. And that's stuff like green hydrogen, that's stuff like synthetic gases or liquid fuels to supply renewable fuels for those sectors. Summing up for the next decade, and that's very crucial for our new incoming government, there are a number of targets that need to be met and that are implicit in these emission reduction targets that we have for 2030 and 2045. And that really these targets, they mean that we almost need a near complete phase out of coal, which is not set in law yet, but because the targets are so tight, it's very hard to see how they can be met without reaching that phase out of coal. We need a massive increase of solar and wind power, roughly factor 2 to 3-fold increase relative to what we have now in solar and wind power capacities. We need to create those markets for zero carbon hydrogen and e-fuels. We need a full dominance of battery electric vehicles in new sales by 2030. And we need really to take care of all these existing homes that are not yet energetically refurbished and double the pace of it, which is another big challenge. So overall, there are very massive, big new investments in near zero, low carbon solutions, also in industry, steel, chemical, cement. And that's a big push, a huge opportunity for modernization of the industry overall, but at the same time also a very substantial challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar. Maria, thinking a little bit about the political context in which all of this immense effort needs to take place. You know, Germany just went through a significant election and is in the process of forming a new government. Can you help us understand the opportunities and challenges ahead for the new government in regards to pushing forward a domestic agenda to achieve the scale of effort needed?
Thanks a lot, Rory. Delighted to be part of this conversation, and greetings to Berlin, to all those who are listening in. To your question, what we now see emerging is the so-called traffic light coalition, which is composed of three parties: the Social Democrats, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens. And this is in fact the first one on the federal level in German history, which brings, of course, several challenges with it, as there are several issues where parties have different, sometimes opposite views, including taxation, public debt, engagement with major powers like China and Russia, the NATO spending, et cetera, but climate offers a great opportunity, as this has been part of the election campaign of all three parties. It will be definitely one of the priorities of this coalition, and we can expect the government to come out with the talks with a fairly ambitious policy agenda on climate, as the Greens have in fact made an agreement on coalition pact aligned with the 1.5 development pathway, a prerequisite for their participation in the coalition. And both them and the Liberal Democrats see climate as one of their top foreign policy priorities. So there are, even on climate, several major areas of friction. Among them are the coal phase-out date, the role of gas in Germany's decarbonization efforts and its international engagement, or the phase-out of internal combustion engines and shift to net zero emission vehicles. And particularly the last two are likely to remain points of friction well into the new legislation period, as the leading Social Democrats party clearly favors fossil gas as a transition fuel, which is it sees is needed to enable the double phase out of coal and nuclear energy, while the Greens made it their long-standing point that gas demand will need to continue sinking throughout the 2020s and decline rapidly after the 2030 if Germany is to deliver its own carbon neutrality goal by 2045. The Liberal Democrats, in their turn, traditionally represent the automotive industry interests, and of course, are likely to be the main blocker on the way to setting an end date for internal combustion engines, and will probably opt for a strong push for synthetic fuels. And there will also likely be foreign policy readjustments, with the Greens party set to more strongly align the foreign policy agenda with climate and human rights agendas, looking at critical raw materials and low carbon technology and equipment supply chains. So what we see now is that climate and energy transition topics are still among those being negotiated by the parties, and as the Greens framed it, in brutally exhausting negotiations with preliminary outcomes probably expected by mid this week. But I'd argue that even more important than finding a common position on the issues I just outlined is a focus on the actual delivery of key policy milestones. And many of those have been already agreed in the past years and been accepted by the new government. And among others, the new government will need to define a realistic pathway to deliver on Germany's own climate target of 65% emissions reduction by 2030. Also establish a solid regulatory base for supporting German industry as a frontrunner in green technologies. But most importantly, the new government will need to drastically pick up the tempo of renewables rollout and the expansion of the power grid transmission and distribution infrastructure. Particularly, the deployment of power grid infrastructure has been extremely slow in the recent years, and creating new incentive for the utilities to double down on efforts will be key, not just for rollout of renewables, but because rapidly acting on renewables and power infrastructure deployment is crucial for decarbonization of key sectors. Power, of course, one of them, but also heating and large industry segments. They all depend on whether the new government will be able to address this legacy of the previous government. So this is maybe one of the most important points. The heating sector is a key area here, and we see that several European countries now have clear dates for new boiler phase out. Germany risks falling behind if they don't act quickly on this. And they also need to send the right signals, both to the consumers, but also to the industry and to the workforce that are involved in the heating sector, on what skills they actually need to develop, on what scale of finance is needed to enable this change. Maybe as a final remark, even if we look just at Germany's domestic agenda, we see that the European Union and the European Union's climate and energy priorities will be central for Germany. When we look at this explanatory paper that has already been published ahead of the coalition talks, we see that the parties have confirmed that all German energy policy projects will need to be aligned with the European law. And this basically means that internalization of the EU Green Deal will inevitably be one of the new government's central priorities. I will stop here for now. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, Maria. Andreas, we've heard from Gunnar on the scale of the challenge and from Maria on what this means domestically in the context of the new German government and even more broadly with the EU. Can you help us broaden out a little bit more to the international arena and help us understand Germany's role in global efforts and some of the geopolitical dynamics that may emerge as global climate efforts ramp up?
Well, thanks very much, Lauren, for having me. And it's a great pleasure to be on such a wonderful panel. Look, I guess what I'd like to do is simply make 3 quick points with regards to the international arena. The first is that the low carbon energy transition as part of the broader climate policy conundrum that we're talking about here does not necessarily end energy geopolitics, it simply changes them. So a key question here, I guess, is how do we deal with the ones that supplied us with fossil fuels throughout the last decades, if not hundreds of years, whilst we've built up the kind of economic model that we live on. So how do we deal with petrostates? And the point here is essentially that they're very much stuck in a path-dependent economic pattern where an extractive industry is dominant. It's very hard to change course. Political regimes are built around economic rents from oil and gas, and they have a social contract going on in many of those places where the government, promises prosperity or at least stability, in return for which the ruling elite keeps on ruling the country. So the moment you start decarbonizing, particularly beyond the 2030 date that has just been mentioned so often, and rightly so, this may mean that the social contract starts breaking in those economies and those countries simply because governments can no longer deliver on that very social contract. And here I'm not so much worried about Russia, for instance, or Saudi Arabia. These are diversified and rich countries of both. I'm more worried about countries like Algeria, countries that are closer to home, particularly when it comes to Germany and Europe, and countries that have fewer alternatives and are less able to diversify their economies because of them being smaller economies and them essentially having fewer options than bigger economies such as Russia or Saudi Arabia. So here the first point really is, how do we deal with petrostates? The second point I'd like to make here is, I guess, the moment we're ending the fossil fuel era and we're heading towards that, we shouldn't kid ourselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that energy imports will be gone. And that's precisely where the ambassador came in and started talking about hydrogen, because some of the hard to decarbonize sectors that Gunnar also mentioned still need molecules, heavy transport, air fried steel, aluminum, and all of those. And green hydrogen is the fuel of choice here, apparently. And it cannot be produced at home at sufficient quantities. That has a lot to do with land use, with acceptance rates among the population of additional wind parks onshore, et cetera, and that requires us to ask, with whom do we partner up with for covering the import needs of a green hydrogen economy going forward? The long and short of that is it will change energy geographies. We might be trading less with Saudi Arabia or Russia, we might be trading more with Chile or Morocco. It might mean opportunities for altering their development model towards, say, a green industrialization type of model. But it also means other nations might be doing that as well. The Germans are not alone, the Europeans are not alone, which means we're going to see more competition with other nations for green hydrogen. And here the bottom line essentially is that climate policies on the international level change energy relations, but they do not necessarily mean autarky for the countries pursuing them. And then a final point I'd like to quickly touch upon is I think, a very important question, which is how do we deal with countries that end up lagging behind in decarbonization? At the backdrop of this is that not everyone goes equally fast. There's countries that lag behind already now, that go not as quickly as others do. And that may be of political choice, because of political choices. Countries not taking the right decisions. But it may also be because of structural problems. Countries not having access to clean technology, countries not having access to enough climate finance. And we have done some work here on this and did a survey amongst global decision makers about a possibly growing divide between climate leaders and climate laggards. And the findings are that there may indeed be some pretty negative feedback loops at play where climate laggards start losing competitiveness, and this loops back into them further losing the ability to decarbonize, and at the end of which those countries lose out economically and might become a source of instability. So the point here is we should not assume that decarbonization is something that just happens naturally. There is a lot more that needs to be done. So the bottom line really is it's crucial to do everything we can do to push climate policies in a post COP26 environment, but we probably want to really make some effort to address the side effects of going low carbon. Otherwise, we create security problems or new inequalities. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
That's 3 really great points, Andreas. Thank you. We have questions coming in already, and I have a long list of questions, and we have 25 minutes. So I'm going to ask 2 more sort of broad questions to just give you all an opportunity to highlight some key issues, and then we'll get to the discussion part with the audience. So if you are watching live, please do feel free to submit a question. There's a box right under the video on the website. So let's talk about the US-German relationship. We heard from the ambassador about the significance of the US-Germany climate and energy partnership. I'd like to pose this question to all of you. Do you see the same potential for the partnership that she laid out? And how do you think that it might be helpful in addressing some of the issues that you've raised this morning? Gunnar, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to start. I fully agree with Andreas, particularly regarding this shift in the geopolitics of energy that's ahead of us. And this is very fundamental. And there are autonomous effects that are going on, and we just see very rapid technological change. And this is also what makes things exciting and creates the opportunity part of the energy transition, that just solar PV has reduced its cost by 85 or 90% over 1 decade. And there's more in the pipeline. We look at electric vehicles. Batteries get so cheap, it's not a matter of if, but rather a matter of when. Owning an electric car is cheaper than driving a combustion engine car. And all these components really, just create a huge shift, which will also affect industrialized countries. It will affect the oil producers. It will affect others. And we will only be successful if we are in this together and kind of mutually reinforce this big change. And Germany has a special position there because we are squeezed with a very tight timetable. At the same time, we are limited in our renewable resource. We will need to shift or to exchange our fossil-based energy imports by renewable energy imports that we cannot create on our own soil, just because we are a small country with huge energy demands, just because of all the industry and the relatively big population density. And this is where the US comes in and is an interesting partner, just as some other solar-rich countries are. And then the second point is, of course, as industrialized countries, it doesn't stop with energy carriers. There's also energy-intensive goods, and that's steel, that's chemicals, and that's kind of the next border where we expect a major big shift. And there we need to coordinate, because otherwise the international markets will be entirely distorted if we don't manage to align our policies, at least roughly.
Andreas or Maria, do you want to add anything? Maria, go ahead.
Thanks, and absolutely agree with the points just mentioned by Gunnar. And of course, this is probably the key focus that both countries need to keep when looking at the international engagement that Andreas just mentioned. Engagement with fossil fuel producing countries, and those particularly those that are vulnerable to the transition. On the US-German partnership, to the points that have been rightfully mentioned by Ambassador Haber, of partnership being a key instrument for coordinating actions on energy and climate, a major focus on innovation, including low carbon technology, hydrogen, green steel, and an opportunity to coordinate efforts as two leading standard setters on product efficiency, in particular, as both countries have a track record and among the most ambitious efficiency standards worldwide. But I also think finance must be a central point of this kind of international package, as the US has, even before Glasgow, already set an important precedent by shifting multilateral development finance from fossil fuels to clean, according to the recent Treasury guidance. And then both countries have joined this international statement to align international public finance with with the clean energy development goals. What is crucial here is, aside from phasing out finance in harming fossil fuels, is to really come up with an offer and an alternative offer to the countries on what will be phased in instead. Because right now we see this kind of a rift between the global south and north widening even further, where the global south countries feel kind of betrayed and left aside, while the OECD countries are running away with their own decarbonization goals. And this kind of a rift cannot happen if we want to have a global climate and energy transition agenda. And US and Germany, both as major international financiers of energy, can actually work together on thinking through what this kind of offer could look like and how to coordinate efforts in this. And maybe as a final point, what Andreas already mentioned, this outreach toward fossil fuel producing countries. When we look at what happened at COP26, we see that the US has been pivotal in its outreach towards Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China, and kind of leveraging their reactions and their behavior during the COP26 conference. We didn't see major backlash. We didn't see them come as game spoilers during the conference, not at the major ones at least. And John Kerry's team has a lot of credit to take for this. And given that the next COP will be, in fact, hosted by Egypt, also one of the gas producing countries, one of the fossil fuel producers, with a major focus on the development, on the global south, on the sustainable economic growth, and probably we can expect the fossil fuel producing countries to kind of coordinate their response to the OECD countries' agenda better than this time. It might be a very good area for engagement for US and Germany to kind of coordinate their own communication and outreach efforts, given that they have very strong relationships with these countries.
Thank you, Maria. Andreas, did you want to weigh in on that?
Just very quickly, I think, first of all, finance, I think, is a key issue here. We're talking about the US and Europe as the world's two prime markets, and not only in terms of trading blocks, but also as the ones that essentially have the ability to mobilize the funds that are needed to pull this off in other parts of the world. And I mean, at the very end, if you look at renewable energy investments over the last couple of years, I mean, whilst roughly 50+% of that went into non-OECD nations, among those, it's only 10% of the entire investment that really went into a part of the world where probably about 4 to 5 billion people live. And that's not even close to being enough to avoid the future emissions that will come along from those places. And so it is imperative for Europe and the US to work together to close the finance gap, to make sure we're getting at the 100 billion and beyond. And because at the very end, whatever we do at home, it will not be nearly enough to avoid the kind of emissions that we see from those countries unless we act right now. So I think this is precisely where leadership needs to come in. But let me maybe also make a quick second point. When doing all of this, and when engaging in a hopefully kind of virtuous green race for the best solutions and the best technologies available and all of that, I think we need to still bear in mind that there's two fundamental different logics at play in the US and Europe. In the US, it's very much about opening opportunity for companies, for markets, for products to scale up, for technologies to bring down costs, and for people to make money with these things. And that's a key concern for any of the administrations that are at least progressively minded ones. But in Europe, it's very different. The approach there is also about essentially mobilizing public funds, but in a very different way. What you do essentially is you set targets, you regulate, you have a regulatory state approach to things. And that has a lot to do with how the EU works. It doesn't have a big fund. It's not a state. It is a very different animal that in the end can do one thing and one thing only, which is regulate. And that's precisely how they work. This is important because the way you try and mobilize funds is very different. You don't try and pour money into some sector. What you do is you come up with a taxonomy for the sake of the argument, and you say, look, we're going to, fill a big spreadsheet saying this is the stuff that we would like you to invest in, and this is the stuff that we would not like you to invest in. And if you invest into the wrong stuff, you might simply no longer make money on it. The EU taxonomy is something that that is, I'm not saying it's unthinkable in the US, but it's at least not necessarily how the US would think about clean investment and how to pull it off. And the reason why I'm making this point is because I can see quite a few situations where conversations on both sides of the Atlantic might get stuck simply because they're talking about the same thing, but very different means to get there. And I guess leveling that conversation a little bit and managing expectations of how both sides view cooperation and what the tools are that are behind this. This is going to be essential because otherwise we're not going to move this any forward.
Really interesting point. Thank you, Andreas. Let's see, I'm watching the minutes. There's a few good questions, but I want to ask one more because this came out in a couple of conversations that we had in advance of the panel, and the importance of thinking about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. Gunnar, could you briefly describe the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and what potential you see for it? And then I would like to ask Maria and Andreas the same question if they want to weigh in on that. And then I'm going to ask you to keep your responses fairly short, though, so that we can get to a couple of the good questions that have come in from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. The point is that in Europe, much of the decarbonization will be driven by a carbon price. And that's how things work. And also given the ambition of the targets that we have for 2030, it's very hard to think how that can be reached without carbon pricing mechanism as a central pillar of climate policy. And like if you look at the initial analysis, we're talking about something, I would say in the triple digits per ton of CO2, like $100, $150 euros per ton of CO2. And that will, of course, change the price of key commodities that are traded. And I mentioned earlier, steel, chemicals, ammonia, these kind of things. These are relatively high carbon in the way they are produced right now. There are also low carbon ways of doing that, but it's more expensive. If that transition towards low carbon modes is induced by that carbon price, that makes it more expensive for companies to produce it, these commodities, and they can pass it on to the consumers if all their competitors are also subject to the same CO2 price. Of course, if we look at the international trade and then there are different regulations in different parts of the world, that's a problem. And that's what European companies complain about. If they are subject to a 150 euro per ton of CO2 carbon price and American or Chinese competitors are not, that will put them into a disadvantage. And that's where this carbon border adjustment mechanism comes in. It would be about taxing imports based on the explicit or implicit carbon pricing that is present at the state. So steel produced in China without regulation would be subject to a tariff that's equivalent to the carbon tax that's applied in Europe. And that becomes increasingly meaningful to the extent that we have ambitious targets applied to the industry. And it will be relevant for the time horizon until 2030.
Thank you, Gunnar. Andreas or Maria?
Yeah, I can quickly weigh in with a few thoughts. I guess the most important bit about CBAM is essentially the deliberate move of the EU to link trade and climate policies. And you may ask, why is this? Why don't they do anything else? And the answer is, well, there's not very much else that they can do because the EU is in charge of trade. That's it, right? And so if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You take what you have and you try and kind of leverage it. It makes a lot of sense, but it is tricky because it hinges on the internal logic of, for instance, having a carbon price. Now, let's look over to the other side of the Atlantic. What's the problem there? No carbon price. So how do you make sure you don't get into your crosshairs, each other's crosshairs about implementing carbon tariffs? Well, the answer is it's going to be tricky probably, because you have to find a mechanism of accounting for an equivalent of what's not there, which is a carbon price, because otherwise you start taxing American products at the border. And you have the same thing in other parts of the world, including in China, which at the moment is experimenting with carbon emission trading systems, which the US is as well, by the way, on a sub-state, on a sub-federal, on a state level, but not on a national level. And this is where things get really hairy, because they might land in front of the World Trade Organization. We might get into trade disputes and all these kind of things. Very much depends on the design as well of whether this works or not. But what looks like a very smart and important tool to avoid carbon leakage, which is industry going abroad, producing elsewhere at lower standards, might become actually a source of friction. And this is something that I guess also from a transatlantic perspective is going to be something very interesting to address, because otherwise we get a $16 trillion economy, that's the EU, and a $20 trillion economy, that's the US, clashing on a thing that both want, which is climate policy.
If I may add very shortly to that, just on the potential of CBAM, I think we already see or potential it has, because it already started to impact the climate and energy policies and actions in the partner countries, with Russia maybe being the most obvious example, where we see the business sector, which is anxious about the kind of possible competitiveness loss, started to move and push the government to come forward with this more ambitious in climate energy policy as soon as CBAM went on the Commission's agenda. And now we see this has resulted in Russia launching its pilot ETS system on the Sakhalin, with plans to enhance to further regions to make them exempt from the CBAM regulations. We see Russia came forward with its own decarbonization strategy for all its lackings. It's a first, and many other things. So before it has even been put in place, it already impacts the climate and energy thinking in the partner countries. But I think for it to truly have an effect, and a constructive one, the communication to the key countries likely to be most effective is crucial on the part of the EU. And it's not just Russia, it's Turkey, it's China, but also countries that are particularly vulnerable and dependent on the European market and are at some place of a transition to become part of it. I mean, the Ukraine, which aspires to become part of the common European market, Turkey, which is being, or in process of being synchronized in terms of energy exports, power exports with the European power market, which would be then subject to the CBAM until Turkey becomes a full-fledged part of the European power market. So also including the deliberations on CBAM and the country deals that EU and Germany developed to these countries would be probably one of the key efforts both will need to deliver in the midterm.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, I think we have a couple minutes for questions from the audience. We have a question from Armando Gucce, from who's a MPP candidate at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy. How can the private sector be actively involved when the energy trends just in the span of 3 years have changed from gas being replaced by hydrogen in regards to transition fuel, and new agendas emerging that try to include nuclear energy in the list of alternatives? And I should mention, another question came in from Louis Fredericks, the European Affairs Consultant with Fredericks Consulting, about nuclear energy, and is reaching net zero by 2050 in Germany possible without nuclear energy? Sorry to tie together two different questions, but trying to make best use of our time. Gunnar, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take the nuclear one. Yes, clearly, yes. We have many, many studies, and I just presented one of that in my slides that show that these targets can be reached without nuclear. The reason being that decarbonizing electricity supply, that's the easy part. And we can do nuclear and we can use wind and solar. And by now, wind and solar are cheaper anyway than nuclear power. So that's definitely possible. The bigger challenge is to decarbonize the non-electric energy supply. And that's where you have to go the hydrogen route, or where you have to think about biofuels, but we only have limited sustainable availability of biofuels. So really like hydrogen, e-fuels, etc. This is a solution. And we also there see that just the economics have shifted in a manner over the last decade that renewables, wind and solar is much cheaper than nuclear anyway. Yeah, and the private sector, I think it's very important to have a clear regulatory framework. That's why also the carbon price discussion is so essential in Germany and Europe. And once we have that in place, the market forces and these innovative forces, they can make the best of it. I'm very confident that there are very good solutions that can be achieved, as long as you have like clear constraints for example, a price corridor on carbon prices, which gives you certainty in investments.
Thank you, Gunnar. Maria or Andreas? Maria, go ahead. I'll make it easy.
Okay, sure. No, this is a very important question, I think, on the private sector, because what we've seen from the recent analysis by like International Energy Agency or the other institutes is that private sector will need to come up with over 2/3 of the global energy finance to enable the actual transition to the net zero economy by 2050. So the role of private finance is a crucial one, and it has not been deployed as of yet because there are a lot of regulatory constraints that prevent or that make the investments in the countries that need these investments the most unattractive. There is the cost of capital is very high in the global south. And these are all issues that need to be addressed. And I think their cooperation between the private financing institutions and the public ones in Europe and the US would be key for exchange of best practices, but also I'd say this kind of a active support of the change in the global south would be important. And I don't have a solution for that, of how private finance could be attracted to countries that don't have an enabling environment for that. But maybe Andreas can comment on that.
Yeah, happy to do that. Maybe just two quick thoughts on that one. The first is one of the biggest problems in countries beyond the OECD context, and that's what we've seen from our own work, is that often the question is not whether we have enough people or a population that's big enough. The question is whether, and to make this very simple, whether they are rich enough to afford a certain product or a service. And if they're not, there is no demand pull for companies to come in, not enough demand pull for companies to come in and put down the investment. Because very often, or generally in the renewable energy space, what we're talking about is rather significant upfront investment and low running costs, which means in the very beginning, you have to have a clear business case, a demand pull that's sufficient over a certain period of time so that you can then get the return on your investment. And if the market is not big enough, you don't do this, which means we need to find ways of supporting the business case. And that's precisely where public banks or multilateral development banks, or also bilateral mechanisms, guarantees, for instance, come in so that you start supporting a weak business case in environments that are in the lower and middle income space. But there's another point, which is some of the economies that we're talking about here in the context, they have difficult investment environments, which means FDI won't be there in the first place. A key issue here is de-risking those projects so that they become bankable. And this is also, again, where the developed world and multilateral development banks can come in and do come in. I mean, that's nothing new to them. They do this, but we need to do a lot more of that. We need to do risk projects at scale so that they also happen in places that are less prone to attracting the kind of foreign direct investment that's needed for those countries to decarbonize quickly enough in order to avoid, well, first of all, in order to decarbonize domestically and to have clean energy for all, but second, also to avoid any frictions when it comes to international trade, for instance, with the European Union that puts up a CBAM and starts discriminating against high carbon products at the border, and for a reason. So there's various reasons why we need to do this. There's a justice element to this, but there's also a domestic development element to this. We do have the tools. Let's deploy them.
Thank you, Andreas. This has certainly been a very fascinating discussion, and I'd say it's the start of a conversation, not the end. I want to thank Ambassador Haber and Ms. Rodenhoff and our wonderful panelists, Andreas, Maria, and Gunnar, for your very insightful and thoughtful contributions. Thank you to the German Embassy and the Transatlantic Climate Bridge for your partnership on this event. And thank you to those of you tuning in and for your good questions. And finally, thank you to my Wilson Center colleagues in the Global Europe program and our AV team for making this morning possible. Enjoy your day, and we will see you again soon. Thank you very much.